ASTERIX and OBELIX. A couple of French Gauls who over 60 years have defeated endless streams of the Roman army from taking over their village, and doing so with absolute ease thanks to the constant injection of their magic strength inducing potion. Their comic novels have been translated to over 100 different languages with multiple renditions, finding their way into movies and of course, plenty of video games too. To many in the Western world, this classic duo may seem nothing more than a slightly familiar duo. But go to Europe and you'll soon find somebody that looks at these guys as some of the most iconic characters ever made. And today on Slope's Game Room, I plan to look into the history of this series, how it got created, why it got popular, why many a country outright rejected it, and of course, every single video game too. And boy oh boy, are there a lot of them. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Actually, before going ahead, I just want to say thanks for watching the video. This video specifically has taken months to make, and we have a crazy amount of games to cover. So, if you appreciate the work that I do and you want to support me, then please do click subscribe, like, and then let me know down below what your favourite game in the series was. And if you're new to the ASTERIX franchise and you want to jump in, then this video's sponsor, Instant Gaming, has you covered. Slap them all, easily the best looking game in the series is currently 51% off for the Switch version, and if you want to jump onto the 3D platforming XXL game series, that one is currently 77% off. PC, PlayStation and Xbox codes also exist, along with practically every new big gaming release too. Capcom's Fighting Collection, which features Power Stone, is a wafty 25% off. The Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection is 78% off. The latest King of Fighters is 73% off. Endless amounts of games and DLC, new and old, can be found here most of the time with super high discounts. And unlike other sites, Instant Gaming do not allow third-party sellers, meaning that when you play the latest games bought from the site, you'll be doing so knowing that the keys have come directly from the official suppliers. So, if you want to not only take advantage of this yourself and support the show financially, essentially for free, then check the links down in the top comment. Anyway, enough of that, let's look into the history of ASTERIX. Our story begins with two French teenagers in the 1940s. One René Goscinny and one Albert Uderzo, a couple of mischievous kids who liked nothing more than messing around and drawing. And even though the duo didn't know each other yet, these growing interests would eventually lead them down a road where their paths would eventually cross. René's first professional role found him becoming an assistant illustrator at an advertising company before joining the French army and travelling to New York, where he got to work for the iconic Mad magazine, which, as you can guess, became massively influential for the writer/illustrator. It was here that he discovered the importance of creating stories that would appeal to the largest demographic possible: everyone. Children enjoyed the wacky nature of cartoon movies and comic strips from the likes of Tex Avery, Pete Sellers, Buster Keaton, and of course Laurel and Hardy. But again, of course, so did adults. It was this humour for all ages that resulted in him working with a whole magnitude of different artists, including Morris, which eventually led him to work on the incredible Lucky Luke series. It was whilst working with Morris that René was introduced to the world/international press, who was responsible for translating comics, among other things, into other languages. Eventually they promoted René to the head of the Paris office, which, as you would expect, brought him back home to France. And it was here that he was introduced to Albert Uderzo, the six-fingered, colourblind Walt Disney-inspired illustrator. Yes, quite a lot to unpack there. He was indeed a colourblind illustrator, struggling to see the differences between red and green. And yes, he was born with 6 fingers on each hand, which was surgically removed at birth. Anyway, carrying on. Albert, born in 1927, always had a fascination with drawing, spending most of his free time reading comics, drawing comics, and when he was able to, watching cartoons. This love for the medium resulted in him becoming a photograph editor, which is where he learned how to do text design. And just like Renee, he was able to put it all to good use by illustrating small segments in magazines, which is where he mastered his unique artistic style. And when animation didn't work out for him, he went full pelt into comic strips, slowly moving up the ladder until he too found himself at the International Press in Brussels, which had become the mecca for European comic books thanks to magazines such as Tintin, which, in case you didn't know, didn't just feature Tintin. It was a whole multitude of different stories similar to the Beano here in the UK and I suppose Detective Comics in America. And as you may have guessed, this is where the two met. Renee and Albert instantly hit it off after working on a column for the ladies' magazine Bons Soeurs titled Who is Right? A hilarious by today's standard couple of drawings in each issue that would play out everyday scenarios for the time, such as your husband kissing another lady's hand when meeting her. Should you, the wife, feel embarrassed or not? Who is right? Or what about scenario number 2, where the husband lights up a Cuban cigar and you, his wife, suggest that he should remove the paper ring found in its centre. The husband disagrees. Who is right? I, unfortunately, don't have the answers for you. I could only find this segment of the magazine, so let's all be good keyboard warriors and argue about 1950s mannerisms, shall we? Anyway, as their collaborations continued to get bigger and better, so did their relationship. And after Renee was fired from the international press for attempting to start a union, Alberto plus a few others graciously left with him and started their own syndicate that allowed them to become the owners of their own comics. This led them to continue being able to work with several third-party publishers, including the previously mentioned Tintin magazine, where they released Poussette et Poussif and, more importantly, Papa. Now, for any fan of Asterix, the look and style and even the stories found in Papa should be mighty familiar. An overly strong Native American with all the overly stereotypical traits that you would expect from a comic from this era, alongside his French officer companion Hubert Brussels Sprout, who Papa calls Two Scalp due to his wig. As expected for the time, the characters heavily rely on what was popularized about specific cultures for the time. Are Native Americans really like what the movies and TV shows portrayed them as during this time? No, of course not. But it was that pop culture understanding that drove the stories and the illustrations. Not to make fun of any particular person or culture, but instead just to tell a story that would be suitable for all ages, at the time at least, and a story full of some rather memorable characters. Characters that the Tintin magazine readers would absolutely love, and because of this they became mainstays for quite a few years. Everybody loved these characters, except for one person, and that person was the creator of Tintin himself. Georges Remy, better known as Herg, who is undeniably one of the most influential comic artists in all of Europe, wasn't a fan of the more slapstick nature of the comics, so when Renee and Alberto decided to move on to pastures new and start their own magazine in 1959, he didn't exactly put up much of a fight. Pilot was that magazine. Released on October 29th, 1959, it was an instant success, partly due to the duo's latest creation, Asterix et Goulos. Asterix instantly grabbed the interest of Pilot readers that was already well into the hundreds of thousands from the get-go, and before long it was both Asterix and Obelix that became the unofficial mascot for this new magazine, being shown on the front cover multiple times. Originally, the design of Asterix was going to look remarkably similar to their previous work on Papa, with early sketches showing Asterix to be a large, strong character just like before. However, Renee suggested that the character would stand out more if he was pint-sized, using his wit to fight against the enemies. Alberta reluctantly agreed after suggesting that he has a sidekick or a companion that would be big, strong and slightly dim-witted, and the rest, as they say, is history. And for those that don't know, the story of Asterix goes a little like this. Set in the year 50 BC, the entirety of France, known then as Gaul, was taken over by the Romans under Julius Caesar's rule, all except for one tiny little village where Asterix and the rest of the villagers live. Unfortunately for the Romans, no matter how many times they sent armies of men towards the Gaul village, they all get beaten to oblivion by the barbarish group due to their strength-enhancing magic potion. Similar to Popeye, I suppose, with the spinach, anytime any of these characters take a sip of the magic potion, they become completely unbeatable. All except for Obelix, Asterix's best friend, a fat, lovable, slightly stupid but ultra-powerful Gaul that fell into the magic potion cauldron as a baby, which now has had a permanent effect on him. Adults and children alike rush to read the latest strips of Asterix in Pilot magazine every single week. However, after funding stopped for Pilot, the magazine got taken over and got turned into a more child-friendly read. Which is why, in 1961, Asterix got his first ever standalone comic book, and, I mean, it did okay. 6,000 copies were sold of that first ever story, which isn't bad, but you know, not great. Thankfully, this doubled by the time the next volume was released, and then it happened again with the next, and the next, and the next, until the whole of France had become absolutely Asterix obsessed. Throughout the 40+ adventures that are still being released to this very day, albeit not by the original duo anymore, the two find themselves on a variety of ventures either in or around their village or travelling all over the world, where once again all of the usual stereotypes come into play when visiting said countries. And, for the most part, that may be why Asterix isn't that popular in your country. Now, look, I don't want this history piece to get all heavy, going on about what is right and what is not. After all, we all live in an age where the vast majority of shows, movies, comic books and everything in between are getting censored in order to cater for a more sensitive generation. I, like many others, see splash screens warning me about harmful depictions found in movies and shows that I watched as a kid, and like many, I pause and think, wait, what? What was offensive about this? Leading me to actually look out for whatever it could be, which in turn brings more attention to the outdated literature or imagery. But then again, you do have the ones that stand out like a sore thumb and obviously cannot be repeated in this day and age, and because of this, if a company does want to continue selling this product to a new generation, you can kind of understand why they've had to censor or change certain parts. The problem with Asterix is that not only is this arguably not the right thing to do, but similar to what makes the Red Man red in Peter Pan, for instance, cutting out or changing these parts of your film or comic results in a story not making much of any sense. And that's the issue with earlier books in the series. In fact, it's an issue of a whole heap of European comic books and movies from that era. Unsurprisingly, it was a different time 60 years ago, and just like the comics that came before it, Asterix had characters that were built on popular stereotypes for the time. When searching up the history of Asterix, I sadly found more articles from people arguing whether it had problematic characters, did it have racist undertones, is it too violent? And is the fat shaming of Obelix problematic than I did the actual history of the comics themselves? And, regardless of what you believe, a lot of the content found in these pages, more so in the earlier volumes, are made up with a whole heap of this stuff. So much in fact that simply censoring it removes far too much, making something that simply isn't Asterix, and unlike many other companies, from what I can tell, they don't seem to censor much of anything. Again, I don't want this to become a preachy video or anything like that. Have your own opinion, that's fine, but I do need to bring this up because it is a part of Asterix's history, and simply, this may be the reason that you, if you're from another part of the world, may not realise just how popular this franchise continues to be. As of the recording of this video, we have over 40 official annuals, essentially graphic novels, with plenty of spin-offs to go with it. You got a whopping 15 movies and another one on the way. I'm not talking animated shorts, I'm talking full-length movies. 10 animated, brilliantly animated I might add, and 5 live action, which were massive box office hits I'd like to add, towards the end. And unsurprisingly for all of you Asterix fans out there watching, it was the 12 tasks of Asterix that got me into this franchise. I absolutely loved that film. I watched it over and over again, and for anyone wanting to get into the franchise from scratch, then perhaps that movie isn't the worst place to start. That is, unless you want a more up-to-date animated style, then perhaps go with The Mansion of the Gods. Either way, both are great, and after watching them, if you're anything like me, you'll want to dig deeper and definitely check out those comics. You've got a theme park that I have personally visited multiple times, and not some crappy land shoehorned onto the side of an existing theme park, a massive standalone park that may just be one of the very best in Europe, let alone France. Simply put, Asterix is massive and super well respected, and it's also the reason that we got a whole heap of video games. Starting off, we have Asterix. Just Asterix for the Atari 2600. And yes, quite a few of the games are called that. Released in 1983, this incredibly simple game sees you controlling Asterix around the screen, collecting items and dodging others. Virtually no skill is needed, quite frankly, it's simple as all hell, and not the greatest start for our journey. Although, can you really blame Asterix? Because this game is nothing more than a sprite swap of another game called Taz. Yes, as in the wildly popular Tasmanian Devil, which just goes to show how popular the Asterix franchise was in Europe, right? And as for the first non-port of an official Asterix game, we didn't actually have to wait too long, as later that very same year on the same system, we got Obelix. And this one is actually quite good. You control Asterix, running about on the bottom half of the screen, knocking into and stunning Romans. When you do, they change from blue to white, and once done, you have a small window of opportunity for Obelix, who walks back and forth along the top of the screen, which is when you need to click the button on your controller to make him drop a big rock, aka a menhir, on their heads. And if you don't do it in time, the Roman changes from white to red and becomes deadly to the touch, similar to the ghosts in Pac-Man. Thankfully, Asterix can counteract this by collecting the magic potion, which is randomly dropped by Getafix, again, just like Pac-Man. Like most Atari 2600 games, this one is incredibly simple, but it does a great job of replicating the magic of the comics in a more than acceptable way for the limited hardware. The game sold rather well in Europe, where it unsurprisingly had its biggest reach. However, it did get a small NTSC release run, supposedly in Quebec, which had a large French-speaking population. If you happen to have a copy in that region, it's supposedly worth a pretty penny these days. Back over in France, a small but well-respected game maker called Cocktail Vision, who are most well known for their education titles that had exceptionally high quality graphics for systems like the Amstrad CPC and Thomson MO5, managed to get hold of the Asterix license and released Asterix et la Potion Magique. A stunning action-adventure platformer that is arguably better looking than the vast majority of platformers for the time, especially on the Amstrad. The only problem was, the game is incredibly hard to not only work out what you gotta do, but also control. Because of this, the game sold rather poorly, so poorly in fact, that the PC port of the game has become lost media. Nobody can find a copy of this game anywhere. A real shame, as the game looks really good and at the very least does a great job of replicating a small portion of the story found in the very first Asterix comic. Heck, the physical version of the game even came with a short comic in the manual that was exclusive to the game until 2003. Even with the underperforming sales of this title, Cocktail Vision managed to keep hold of the Asterix license for a whole 3 years, releasing 3 games during that time. And I say games in the loosest possible term. Asterix and the Magic Carpet is essentially a visual novel that tells the story of the comic of the same name, showing off pictures ripped directly from the book, which requires you to choose the correct option in order to move forward. Choose the right option and the story continues. Choose the incorrect option and it's game over. That is literally it. So if you want to read a blocky version of a popular comic, then, well, I suppose you can. Or you can try out their last release, Asterix Operation Get a Fix, which is actually the best looking game in the franchise so far. But again, it's not all that fun to play. Cocktail Vision really did a number on the franchise, as this game plays the same as their first game based on the magic potion. You explore the world looking for ingredients in an attempt to save Get a Fix, with extremely poor controls and very little in the way of an explanation regarding what or how to do that. As stated, this was the final game created by Paris-based Cocktail Vision, who, granted, did a great job of the graphics, but not so much on the gameplay. From here on out, it's mostly uphill. However, before moving away from the home computer scene, there are two other games of note. Asterix and the Magic Cauldron finds you controlling the duo as they venture out looking for broken pieces of the magic cauldron. Thankfully, the game not only looks the part, but also controls significantly better than the games that came before it. The first Asterix game that can be found on the Commodore 64, don't you know? Unfortunately, those graphics come at a price, as every time you switch the screen, the world takes quite a while to be drawn up. Something that you could of course look past back in the day, but nowadays it does indeed make it quite the struggle to get through. In fact, the vast majority of your playtime will be watching and waiting for these screens to be made up. You then fight against various Romans and wild boars, which you will need to do in order to stay alive. And these battles are done in a separate pop-up window that sadly does not involve too much skill besides spamming the attack button and hoping that you win. Sadly, the search for the missing cauldron pieces is something that very few people have ever achieved, as they tend to be hidden in some rather obscure locations, including behind scenery, with no dialogue in or out of the manual suggesting to look in these locations. These cauldron pieces were so well hidden, in fact, that a lot of publications at the time simply thought the game was released unfinished. Also, for those interested, the game was reskinned when it made its way abroad, changing Asterix for a barbarian called Ardok. Thankfully, Asterix and Obelix Die Odyssey is the last game that we'll be looking at from this era, a free albeit official text adventure released with a German magazine for the Commodore 64 in 1986. Virtually no graphics can be found here, and supposedly not a single image of Asterix is seen throughout the whole journey. Obelix appears right at the beginning, but the graphics are so basic that you would never know that it's him. The story has been taken from the Asterix and the Black Gold comic, and of course, if you don't speak German, like me, it's unlikely that you'll get very far in this game. Best just to read the book instead. Right, let's take a massive step forward, shall we, and look at two games that are some of the most iconic in the entire franchise. It seems like everyone, including some of the top game makers of the time, wanted Asterix to become a worldwide thing, and Konami was leading the mob. The company already had a great track record of releasing IP-heavy beat-em-ups from the likes of The Simpsons, The Turtles, and eventually X-Men 2, but one that sadly just does not get the attention that it deserves nowadays is Bucky O'Hare and Asterix. Why doesn't this game get the love that it deserves? Well, it's probably because it's Asterix. Literally, that is it. And let me tell you, it's a crying shame. Because when you take away the iconic IPs, Asterix may just be the best of the bunch. Okay, so firstly, the negatives. You only have 2 players to choose from compared to Konami's other more popular titles, but then again, would you really ever choose anyone other than Asterix or Obelix to play as? And yeah, that's pretty much the only negative. The game not only oozes style with each level being based on a different comic, but you got a decent moveset for each character too. Now from what I can tell, these movesets deal the same amount of damage as each other, but still, they are executed perfectly and give the player a great selection of abilities that can be used to get them out of most scenarios. Of course, just like its arcade brothers and sisters, the game is pixelated, yet it keeps true to the source material better than any of its arcade counterparts. When you play ASTERIX, you are quite literally playing the comic come to life. One of those early examples where you can pause the game, screenshot it and think that it's the real deal. And that still stands true to this day over 30 years later. An absolute must for all arcade beat 'em up fans that for whatever reason may have missed out on this, well, due to the obscure IP. Because of all of this, the game got a very limited release in Japan and even here in the UK. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure it ever got officially released in America, and if it did, it got crazy low numbers. Even in the UK, it was overshadowed by the more popular machines like the Turtles in Time and the Simpsons. However, in France and neighbouring countries, it did well enough to become a staple of most arcades for the time, gaining a cult following from retro enthusiasts just like everyone else does with The Simpsons and the Turtles. And that same affection could also be found when the game first made its way to the home console market. ASTERIX, yep, just ASTERIX again, is one of the best ever games released for the Sega Master System. Tomozu Endo, who worked on some of the system's most well-known and well-loved exclusives such as Castle of Illusion and Sonic 2, was the main guy behind this one. A rather typical platformer that allows you to choose between both ASTERIX and Obelix at the beginning of each stage, and depending on who you pick, each stage will have a different layout, essentially doubling the playtime of the game as a whole. As you would expect, the game looks stunning. The sprites are very well detailed and the enemy variety is top notch, with the Romans dressing up in different costumes, only showing their true identity after they receive the smackdown from the game's main characters. Like many games from the era, your job is to simply make your way to the right and get to the end of each stage. Both characters have a typical punch attack and both have their own unique take on the iconic ground pound. But they also have potions that are used by the player to solve small environmental puzzles in order to continue you on with the stage. Perhaps you need to throw your potion in the water so that it explodes and creates a tiny ledge needed to jump across. Or perhaps you need to stand in a cannon and use the same potion so that it shoots you out over high ledges. Nothing here is too taxing, but does give you some memorable moments that helps make ASTERIX stand out as one of the very best games on the system, that again, you may have never heard of. As, when the game was made in Japan, it only ever got released in Europe and Brazil. Either way, it's great. One of the best 8-bit platformers from the generation, in fact, that got excellent reviews upon release, good enough to get a sequel a year or so later. ASTERIX and the Secret Mission came out right around the end of the Master System's life, and once again was headed up by the same Sega of Japan team, and was only released in Europe and Brazil twice. More on that in a little bit. Once again, the game looks fantastic, possibly better than it did before, and it plays differently depending on who you pick. Although, unlike the last time, the variety between the two has jumped up significantly. As an example, on one stage, ASTERIX, who hates water, has an excellent, albeit quite tricky, surfing stage, which, by the way, looks excellent considering the limited hardware, and if you play as Obelix, you can swim underneath him. This brings a decent amount of replayability once again, and it kind of needs it because unfortunately this game is on the shorter side, clocking in only about 1 hour per playthrough, 1 hour 30 at a push. Simply put, ASTERIX and the Secret Mission takes what the original did and expands on it, way more than you would expect for a region-specific title. And due to the game coming out on both the Master System and the Game Gear in 1993, several years into the Mega Drive/Genesis lifespan, it's even more obscure than the game that came before it. Oh yeah, and regarding that Brazilian re-release, the game once again went under the sprite swap treatment several years later and was released as As Aventuras da TV Colosso, which is based on some popular Brazilian puppet show. Don't expect a dedicated video on that franchise anytime soon.
Maître Sega présente Astérix, le jeu. Partout Atis. Avant de chercher la bagarre, n'oublie pas, Sega, c'est plus fort que toi.
Now, long-time fans of the franchise may have noticed that I've actually skipped over a game that was released on the Master System and the Game Gear, and this one was done by yet another third-party company, Core Design. Asterix and the Great Escape, once again, was only released in Europe and Brazil, and sadly, doesn't live up to the high standard created by Sega of Japan. Now, it's not a bad game per se, but the graphics and the level design layouts leave a lot to be desired here. I mean, most of the game is nothing more than floating colourful platforms. If you ask me, the previous entries are significantly better looking. One of the interesting additions is the ability to change between Asterix and Obelix on the fly. However, doing so seems rather pointless, as Obelix doesn't seem to offer much that Asterix himself can't achieve. The hitbox is horrendous and the attack box is even worse, resulting in you taking damage virtually every time you attempt to hit an enemy. All in all, it's a rather forgettable title that strangely enough also got ported to the Genesis. Yes, this was the first proper game to get released in America, and it's pretty average. It's a crying shame that out of all of those games released so far, that the Sega of Japan games didn't get released in America, but this one did. Just like the Master System game before it, you never need to play as Obelix. The hit and attack boxes are more annoying than anything else, and besides the graphics being, well, okay, capturing the look and feel of the comic to a pretty average standard, the game is simply a forgettable platformer on a system that has more than enough incredible titles in the same genre, making this one completely forgettable. A couple of games that follow the same story but are actually quite a bit different from each other. Just like, yes, Asterix. Again, just Asterix has finally made its way onto Nintendo platforms. All three Nintendo platforms to be precise, as the French publisher and development house Infogrames released games for the NES, the Game Boy and the Super Nintendo all at the same time in 1993.
Avec Astérix, maintenant sur console Nintendo et Super Nintendo, goûtez à la potion magique. Astérix sur Nintendo et Super Nintendo.
Firstly, the NES release, it's great. Sure, the Master System version is better, allowing you to play as Obelix, something that you can't do in these games, as the story indicates that you need to save him. But it's good platforming perfection with a far more forgiving attack box, a bucket load of variety in the level layout, and an excellent soundtrack to boot. As you would expect, the game is extremely repetitive, and hey, that's fine. It doesn't outstay its welcome, borrowing the play style of the Master System games that came before it. The Game Boy release is essentially the same game, albeit with a slightly different level layout to make it work better on the handheld. And yes, it holds up quite nicely too when compared to the NES version. And the Super Nintendo version is entirely different. You see, it was the company Bit Managers, a Spanish development house founded by musician Alberto Jose Gonzalez, who were the guys responsible for the Game Boy and NES ports, whilst Infogrames did the Super Nintendo release themselves. And unfortunately, it's not great. Sure, the graphics are arguably better than the 8-bit renditions, but if you ask me, they are far from great, doing the bare bones needed to turn the sprites into 16-bit renditions. The levels are completely redone, giving off a Euro platforming vibe made up of confusing maze-like levels with virtually no way of knowing where you need to go, as well as a character that controls far differently than before, and not in a good way. All in all, we have yet again another completely forgettable title that was only released in PAL territories, even though at one point it was advertised to be released in other parts of the world until it was eventually cancelled. Infogrames had another crack at the Asterix property by releasing a Mario Party-esque board game for the CDI next, and to be fair, it looks amazing. But like 99% of the CDI games catalogue, it offers almost nothing to the player besides amazing cutscenes. Essentially, what you have is super basic minigames whilst Getafix narrates the comic book styled story and you need to complete mundane puzzles and, well, that's pretty much it. Of course, you had the market for these sort of things back in the day, and I'm sure it did better on PC when that version was released. But yeah, this is as basic as it gets. Thankfully, the company's next game was far more traditional, and for the first time, it let you play as Obelix and ASTERIX at the same time. ASTERIX and Obelix was released in 1995 and was once again created by the Spanish development house Bit Managers. Sadly, the end results were not nearly as good as last time. Sure, the graphics have had a huge facelift, especially on the Game Boy, but it just may be one of the better looking licensed games for the system. But the controls are just downright awful, and that unreliable tiny hitbox is back once again to the anguish of all who played it. Is it possible to hit an enemy without even getting hit yourself? Well, yes, I suppose, but you hardly ever get the chance to do so. It's complete luck, and it's such a shame because ASTERIX and Obelix looks stunning, as does ASTERIX and the Power of the Gods, which is the final 16-bit game that we'll be looking at today. Okay, maybe not as good as what Infogrames did visually, this game does at least look quite good, replicating the comic style quite well, even using the comic stills in its intro cutscene. But sadly, that's where the positives end, for me at least. When looking online, I found quite a few people praising this game, and I have absolutely no idea why. The controls are some of the worst in the series to date, and once again, your attack box may be worse here than any game that came before it. A standard platforming game of a world map that only allows entry to certain levels once certain other levels have been completed. This was done supposedly to give the game more variety and longevity, but sadly, all it does is extend your frustration with the title. On top of that, the music is horrendous, and the cheap deaths from running Romans and fire pits make this my least favourite proper platformer in the series to date. None of this should have been acceptable for a game that came out in 1995, right at the tail end of the Mega Drive's life, which unsurprisingly makes this an extremely expensive game to get complete in box, and also confirms that trying to get every single game for a video game console, your favourite video game console, is a stupid thing to do. It would be a good few years before the Ghoul Jewels would make their way back to the gaming landscape. You had another interactive comic from Egmont Interactive released in Germany, which just may be the rarest game on this list. Not due to its high resale value, but because nobody wanted it then, and nobody wants it now. A German retelling of one of the comics with various basic minigames sprinkled throughout, similar to those interactive Disney CD-ROMs, but again, a whole lot worse. On top of this, you also had a Game Boy Color re-release of the ASTERIX and Obelix game, but obviously in colour. And then in 1999, we got ASTERIX and Obelix Take on Caesar. By this point, ASTERIX's popularity had started to wane. Every few years we got a new comic, but in the 90s we only got 2 new volumes up to this point. And yes, even though we did get a new direct to VHS animated movie, it was very apparent that ASTERIX was very quickly moving into the realm of nostalgia. The recently opened Park ASTERIX was pulling in decent numbers, but this didn't help bring in new numbers to the iconic series the way that the rights holders wanted. Thankfully for them, this was all, well, okay, mostly about to change, as ASTERIX made his way onto the big screen once again for his first ever live action flick, ASTERIX and Obelix Take on Caesar. A popular Flintstones the movie-esque flick that, as you would expect, did brilliantly well in France and okay at best in other parts of the world. In fact, I spent ages trying to find a dubbed version of this movie, and even though it has been re-released multiple times onto Blu-ray and various box sets, the English dub hasn't. The only way you can watch it is by going back and finding the DVD. And hey, look, it's fine. It has a whole lot of fan service, it captures the animated movies quite a bit, and I suppose if you like ASTERIX, you will at least get a chuckle or two out of it, even if Obelix doesn't look anywhere near as fat as he perhaps should. And with the success of that movie, we obviously got a video game adaptation that was quite successful. In France, at least. Asterix and Obelix Take on Caesar may be one of the worst game adaptations I've ever played. In a zany, cartoony world where you need to comically beat up hordes of Romans, you are presented with a game that's extremely low poly, featuring Asterix or Obelix running back and forth across a single path, punching fish and or boulders. Nope, that's literally it. It's kinda like a mix between Breakout and, in some cases on those later levels, Tempest, I suppose, as Getafix drops ingredients for the magic potion and then you need to run around in a circle and grab them before they touch the ground. If you were looking for the definition of shovelware, ladies and gentlemen, this is it. Strangely enough, the original voice actors in every major region came back to voice this absolute mess that was completable in only 30 minutes on your first go. And yes, the Game Boy Color version was even worse. Thankfully, the duo's next outing, which came later that same year, was significantly better. Asterix The Gaelic Wars is a simple yet absurdly addictive real-time strategy game that requires you to take over every region on a map by filling up your magic potion, sending out your troops to take down neighbouring sections of the map, redistributing your troops and then allowing the enemy to do the same. I spent hours and hours, way more than I should have done, capturing footage of this game for this video whilst watching the movies on a second screen. Sadly, the issue with the game is that certain sections of the map require you to instantly go into these small 3D mini-level stages before you can take them over. Most of which are, to be quite honest, impressive looking platform light side-scrolling beat-em-ups, which are okay, as you control Asterix or Obelix along a set path, beating up enemies and dodging basic projectiles. These sections are far from hard, but they do feel incredibly sluggish, with combat that doesn't really connect in any way. And then you got the mini-games, which in some cases are horrendous, incompletable in some instances, where you find Obelix spinning a Roman and letting go just at the right time. I must have tried this 100 times, thanks to save states, and even with the gauge all the way to the top and the shot perfectly aligned, I could never get the Roman to fly more than a third across the field. Eventually I had to just give up and just accept that I would never capture that region, which was a real kick in the nuts after you spent the last several hours capturing the rest of the playfield. On top of this, when an enemy takes over specific regions, you will need to redo these platforming or mini-game levels if you want to recapture them. It makes a fairly decent strategy game outstay its welcome and become quite boring. Granted, I only played the PlayStation version and not the PC version, which by all accounts is better, but after capturing 6 hours of footage and then realising that I was never going to get certain regions, I wasn't about to test if the same thing happens on PC. With all that said, the animated cutscenes and music are truly exceptional, and I cannot suggest checking out a long play of the game enough if you are a fan of the series. With the success of the movies, the new books, the park, the absurd amount of merch, Asterix was finally getting a new surgence in popularity, which obviously means that Infogrames were going to come back and make a whole heap of new video games. Here's Asterix Search for Dogmatics, a beautiful platforming game for the Game Boy Color that was made by Rebellion of all people, which allows you to choose between the two main characters on your mission to find Dogmatics. The game offers a unique twist to the formula, requiring you to venture into specific levels to unlock certain sections that will allow you to play it again as a different character or venture into another. It's a cool idea for a game that is essentially filled with endless amounts of backtracking, and for the most part, it works without becoming too tedious. The controls, on the other hand, well, that's a different story. This game is not fun to control. It looks the part arguably more than most licensed games due to it coming out in the year 2000 right near the end of the Game Boy Color's life, but I can hardly suggest it on that alone. If you're a fan and you're willing to get past the basic but also frustrating gameplay style, I still wouldn't bother. So, what's next? Well, what shovelware-based IP is complete without another party game? Yes, another party game. Remember? CDI did it first? Asterix Maxi Delirium consists of you shooting Romans and random other things with catapults, running around a small map collecting potion ingredients, eating the most amount of food by matching button combinations, basic racing games, and several other forgettable traits. Look, I'm not anti these sort of games as much as you would expect. Of course, they all just make you want to go and play Mario Party instead. But this one isn't too bad. The graphics were pretty decent and the controls for the most part are quite good. I haven't got too much negativity towards this one. In a world filled with shovelware games based on particular IPs, I would much rather have a semi-decent party game than a completely forgettable platformer. Am I right? You remember the Super Nintendo game Asterix and Obelix, right? Well, it's back in Game Boy Advance form, as Bitmap managers decided to port the game as a sort of free little extra alongside Bash Them All, a brand new side-scrolling beat-em-up. And I gotta say, I really did enjoy this one. A well-detailed side-scroller that looks stunning on the Game Boy Advance. Once again, you choose between Asterix and Obelix, spoiler alert. You want to play as Obelix, and you work your way through a pretty standard brawler on a pirate ship across Egypt, inside pyramids, in dungeons, and of course, in Rome. It really is a beautiful game for the handheld, with great background artwork and most importantly, characters that are represented exactly how they are portrayed in the comics and animated movies. In regards to gameplay, I would probably put it somewhere between Golden Axe and The Simpsons. It's not going to be blowing you away, it's actually as basic as they come. Food hidden in crates, lift levels, vehicle-like levels, and some basic mini-games in between. Similar to The Simpsons, it's not going to be breaking the mold, but it's good enough to do the source material justice. And regarding that Asterix and Obelix port, it's pretty much the same. It wasn't that good back then, and it isn't that good now. Still, nice to get it included, I suppose. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the last game to be put out by Infogrames. Well, actually, you see, Infogrames went on a bit of a spending spree, and among the game studios they purchased, Hasbro Interactive owns the rights to a particular name known the world over, and that name was Atari. And therefore, Infogrames became Atari. And that's why the majority of games since this point have all been labelled as Atari games. And yes, this started some of the best 3D Asterix games we ever got. I'm of course talking about the XXL series, which started in 2009. But before we tackle that, we do have several mobile games that got popped out over the next few years, so let's just tackle those first, shall we? Asterix Rescue Obelix was a 2005 Java game, a basic platformer that bears a striking similarity to the overly average Asterix and Obelix on Super Nintendo. I mean, hey, it's fine for a 15-minute romp, which isn't far off the total playtime, where you painfully and slowly move along and collect grid coins, punch Romans, and get to the end before doing it all again. And if you think that's basic, you're right. But it's about to get a whole lot more basicer up in here. As the very next year, Asterix and the Vikings was released on mobile phones to help promote the latest animated movie of the same name. An excellent and stupidly underappreciated hand-drawn animated Asterix movie, I'd like to add, which of course uses the same engine as before, tasking you to do exactly what you did before, move from left to right, punching Vikings, this time instead of Romans, and collecting skulls instead of coins. In 2007, we had Asterix and Cleopatra, which are essentially tiny segments of the previous platforming sections, turning them into mind-numbing mini-games spread across a board game-styled setting similar to Mario Party again. And finally, in 2009, we had Asterix and Obelix Encounter Cleopatra, which just may be the most impressive Java game I've ever seen. This time, the game was developed by Gameloft, who had quite a lot of experience with this platform. The end result is several highly detailed levels where you awkwardly control the duo through multiple platforming stages, top-down Zelda-like stages, and even the occasional mini-game too. The most important thing to take from these Java games is that they seriously do look the part. Sure, they're probably not worth playing at all, but similar to the majority of games up to this point, they've all managed to capture the comics and animated movies pretty damn well. So for that at least, they're worth at least going to look at, I suppose. Anyway, let's move on to the XXL series, shall we? Where we need to decide which version we're going to be playing. Now, these games have been remastered, or should I say romastered. Haha, nice. Slope approves. So surely that's going to be your best bet, right? Well, luckily enough, I was able to get a free copy of the entire remastered trilogy as part of the Slap 'em Up game from Strictly Limited, which was kindly donated to the show. Thank you very much. Now, we will be looking at this set in more detail as the video goes on when we get back to the Slap 'em Up games, but for now, let's look at this. This absolute atrociously remastered XXL original that at first, yeah, I mean, it looks alright, until you get later into the game and then realise that the frame rate drops to practically nothing when you have loads going on the screen. Now granted, I am playing the Nintendo Switch version, and from what I've seen, the PlayStation 4 version seems to run a whole lot better. And yes, it does have the option to change it to the old style graphics on the fly, which does improve the frame rate a tad, but still, I can't say that I'm not disappointed with how this was ported. Either way, frame rate aside, should you play this one? It depends. It depends on the sort of gamer you are. Unlike the 3D Mario games or plenty of other 3D platformers, it isn't exactly something you can recommend to absolutely everyone. But if you do like PS2, N64 and GameCube era platformers, because that's when this game came out, then I cannot suggest it enough. Back when this came out, I decided against it, as I assumed it was just going to be your average shovelware, and you know, it does have that vibe to a degree. It's an extremely basic platformer slash 3D beat 'em up from the era. You know, collect a certain amount of objects or defeat a certain amount of enemies before moving on to the next, and then doing that on loop for 75% of the game. Shop for minor upgrades that most of the time you will not use, occasional vehicular combat sections, carry the burning torch through wind tunnels before it goes out, blah blah blah. It's all stuff that you've done before, and it's all incredibly generic. But keep in mind, this was a game that was released during a time when these sort of games were all the rage. And besides it being extremely repetitive, especially with its enemy variety, I gotta admit, I enjoyed it. The perfect definition of a solid 7. Not great, but far from a bad game that perfectly represents platformers of that era. And yes, it is definitely worth mentioning the Game Boy Advance port. For no reason other than it looks utterly fantastic. A fully realised 3D world that, yes, is more than a little rough around the edges, but is still stupidly impressive running on the limited hardware, and is often looked at as one of the most graphically impressive games for the system, that surprisingly plays pretty damn well. Of course, nowadays it's only really worth it to experience just how impressive it is, but hey, go ahead and do that thing. It really is worth it just for that alone. Also, before moving on to XXL2, let's give another shout out to this port when it was re-released as a budget re-release, which not only included that game, but also the Bash 'em Up game too, which also included the ASTERIX and Obelix game, making this a 3-in-1 game. I know these compilations are not exactly worth it monetary wise for Game Boy Advance collectors, but this is fantastic and has something for everyone. Right, on to XXL2, and yes, again, we will be looking at the remastered version of this game. It's pretty much more of the same. Although in an attempt to market the title to a wider audience, the game has more borderline copyright parody material than any other game I've seen in a long time. Most of which can be seen on the front cover, which shows Roman guards holding Pac-Man shaped shields, wearing Mario Sunshine shaped armor, and most bizarrely, a Sonic outfit complete with gold rings. All of which is in a Grand Theft Auto stylized box formation. And the game continues with this as soon as you start it up, as you're introduced to one of the Roman spies called Sam Schiefer. Seriously, the parodies or nods to classic franchises are sprinkled all the way through this title. Seriously, it goes on and on and on. From Zelda statues, to Tetris walls, from Space Invader hieroglyphics, to Quake posters, Romans that look like Rayman, temples with Jak and Daxter art and Mortal Kombat art, Final Fantasy, Pac-Man, Legacy of Kain. Shall I go on? Okay, Donkey Kong statues, Pikmin statues, Crash Bandicoot statues, Spyro puppets, Choo Choo Rocket artwork can be found on the floor, you have Half-Life symbols found on a sarcophagus, Bomberman and Beyond Good and Evil costumes are hidden in the locked up cages, one of the shops has a character from Bubble Bobble hanging outside, Star Fox, Lemmings, Unreal Tournament, Monkey Island, Doom. Playing this game and randomly coming across these references is all part of the fun, and I can't believe that they got away with this. Guys, seriously, I'm only showing you some of the references. There are so many more. Anyway, as for the game itself, it's pretty much the first. A harmless 3D platformer that has been slightly improved over the original and is, well, it's more of the same. Although this time you can jump between Asterix and Obelix on the fly as opposed to that action randomly triggering like it does in the original. The story is pretty forgettable, the bosses are arguably not as good as the first time around, but the enemy variety and, as stated, those references make it a worthwhile game to play through for people that want a more collectathon heavy platform brawler type games that were all the rage from the early 2000s. Seriously, again, I cannot suggest this game enough if you are someone that likes those 3D platformers of the era. The same game was slightly downgraded for a PSP release a year or so later, and the DS release that was pumped out around about the same time. It's essentially the same game storyline wise, but fixed to a 2D plane, giving off a sort of 2.5D graphical style, and again, unless you fancy collecting Asterix games, it's really not worth it. Just go play the far superior originals or the Rome Master instead, which sure is still rough around the edges, but again, this game was released at a time when these sort of games were being pumped out every other month. I'm seriously regretting not picking this up back in the day, so much so that I got quite excited about playing XXL free. However, XXL 3 is a very different sort of game. A top-down, a more isometric down brawler that finds our heroes travelling to find upgrades for the rock that Obelix carries around on his back, better known as a menhir. These work in the game as a mechanic, as these upgrades result in various elemental attacks performed by the duo as you go around beating up thousands of Romans. Now, personally, I am quite a big fan of these sort of games. However, this one is the worst of the trilogy, simply because it's way too repetitive. Similar to the original XXL, it feels like a game that has the basics down for what it's trying to go for, but needs at least one more entry before it can provide a good amount of variety to an extremely basic game. With that said, it's only a 4 or 5 hour long game anyway, which does work in its favour. As a multiplayer game, I highly recommend it, but as a solo game, even with the short playtime, it outstays its welcome by the time you get about 2/3 of the way through. Still, it looks great. The frame rates do sadly drop down significantly in this title like they do with the original XXL, so maybe getting PS4 or Steam codes will be your best bet here. Either way, it does play great with simple puzzle elements that 9 times out of 10 are based on the elemental powers of your crystal menhir. It's a solid entry in the franchise that again is worth picking up for a budget price, especially considering that budget price usually comes with the other 2 XXLs on the same cartridge. And that is something that I can truly get behind. Although we will talk about all of the different and bizarre ways you can do that in just a bit. Jumping ahead slightly, we have yet another game in the XXL series confusingly titled Asterix and Obelix XXXL, the Ram for Hibernia. This is not yet another remake of the first XXL game, but instead is essentially XXL 4. following on from the top-down formula of the last entry and sadly not moving forward with the formula but instead taking several major leaps back, as this just may be the most repetitive title in the entire franchise. Well, actually no, that one's still to come. Heavily pushing the 4-player mode found within, even though it only lets you play as the main 2 characters, the game is super short, super easy, and sadly super boring. Once again, like the majority of Asterix games up to this point, it does really look the part, but that's the only positive I can give it. Huge areas with virtually nothing to explore, filled with endless amounts of the same Romans that all get taken down the exact same way, and the occasional puzzle that a child could work out on their very first playthrough. Right, before moving on to some of my absolute favourites in the series, we got a few other shovelware games to get through. Firstly, Asterix and the Olympic Games was a Wii title that was made to coincide with the movie, and this just may be one of the strangest movie tie-ins I've ever seen. The movie, which of course does feature the Olympic Games but has a lot more going for it than that, is not portrayed in this game storyline-wise whatsoever. Instead, the game acts as a sort of multiverse setting for the movie. The game, other games, board games, and even the comic book all merging into one all-new story that makes this whole thing one of the most bizarre entries in the entire franchise, regardless of its medium. You expect this to be a sports-filled mini-game similar to track and field or Sonic and Mario at the Olympics, but that's really just a very small part of this game. The other 75% is essentially XXL2 again. And I very much approve of that. It seems like the platforming has been one of the main focuses for this entry, which helps the game differentiate itself from the titles that came before it. And even though we didn't get a remaster of this game, no doubt due to its now extremely obscure movie tie-in multiverse storyline, it did get a re-release onto the 360 where the game was significantly enhanced with better graphics and a much better frame rate. I know I've said this a lot, but if you're a fan of Asterix, I cannot suggest this game enough. This game is so weird, and besides it being a more than adequate 3D platformer, it's that story that makes it stand out, bringing a multiverse storyline to a franchise that you would never expect to get one. And obviously, a good few years or so before Marvel did the same thing. Moving on, during the release of the XXL games, we got 2 completely different types of games. Asterix Brain Trainer was a game that, as you may have guessed, propelled the world of Asterix into the booming popularity of the brain training games of the era for the system. A game aimed mostly at children with original artwork throughout by the creator himself, with a few mini-games included too. Then you have These Romans Are Crazy, the first and only game from Ubisoft, who after getting the license did nothing more than release a standard board game style title with basic mini-games that require you to do nothing more than use your stylus. Once again, Asterix had moved into the world of shovelware, and what's really bad about this title is that this title was released to coincide with Asterix's 50th anniversary. Bandai Namco had a go next at milking the franchise by creating a sort of Clash of Clans style game that, in all fairness, is actually the perfect type of franchise to adopt into a comically hysterical cash-grabbing mobile strategy game, but it doesn't make me like it because of that. Either way, the game does seem to have a decent following for those that like this sort of thing, and credit where credit is due, it does indeed look the part. Now, if only someone would use these graphics and create a decent RPG, I can die happy. But all we have is a remaster that, once again, does indeed look the part. This was followed by yet another game by the same studio called Idle Asterix for mobile phones that requires you to do nothing more than tap multiple times at the enemy, which would run in from the right towards one of the villagers. You are then rewarded with coins that you can use to make your taps more powerful, and you can keep doing this until you get bored and uninstall it. no doubt about 5 minutes after you install it. Now, in the developer's defense, their third and currently final game did look to have a fair amount more time spent on it. ASTERIX and Obelix Heroes, a mobile turn-based strategy deck-building role-playing game that somehow got turned into a full-price PC and console title. It really doesn't get more basic than this, and it completely blows my mind that someone managed to get this physically released. Still, for fans of these sorts of games, this one does seem to have a decent cult following behind it. It's not for me, so it's unfair for me to review it based on my opinions, as looking online, the few reviews I have seen confirmed its addictiveness, which I assume is a good thing for games like this, right? Next up, we have Big Ben Interactive, who created another movie tie-in, this time for Mansion of the Gods, which just so happens to be one of the absolute best animated movies from the long line of animated ASTERIX movies. Oh, and by the way, there is a new Netflix show as well, and that too is absolutely awesome. Mansion of the Gods for the 3DS may look the part and play perfectly fine, but it's also a super basic title involving you running around, hitting Romans from a top-down perspective, replanting trees and performing extremely basic minigames with the touchpad that loosely translate to the plot of the movie. I mean, for a 5-year-old, it's fine, and it reminds me of the absolute tosh that my kids used to want to play, where you do nothing more than put ingredients into a pot and stir it. So I suppose for that demographic, it's adequate, but it really is only for that demographic. Which finally brings us back to the genre that I like the most: side-scrolling beat-em-ups. A genre that seems to be getting a major resurgence at the moment, with excellent titles like Double Dragon, Streets of Rage and The Turtles all getting new releases in their respective franchises, along with plenty of other games too. So much, in fact, that we're definitely past the point of getting excited when a new game in the genre comes out, and more aware of what's good and what's not. And I'm happy to say that ASTERIX Slap 'Em All is one of the better ones. Albeit barely. Again, going all the way back to 1991, ASTERIX, the Konami-created arcade game, may be the black sheep of the brawlers released by the company, but that's solely due to its obscure IP as opposed to its gameplay. So, with that in mind, a new ASTERIX brawler is obviously going to be extremely exciting to the people that grew up with that original ASTERIX game, the same way you would be excited when a new Turtles game comes out. Straight off the bat, the game is absolutely stunning. By far the best looking ASTERIX game, bar none. Excellently animated with crazy amounts going on the screen at any given time, which is exactly what it should be like. And not once did my Switch copy of the game suffer from any slowdown. As stated many times on the Slopes Game Room show, I always imagined as a kid when playing games like Castle of Illusion and Aladdin that one day in the future, games will look like real cartoons. And this, along with plenty of other new age titles, was exactly what I envisioned. The way these iconic characters smash through enemies in the cartoons is perfectly replicated here. Again, better than any game that came before it, and as a fan, it feels great to perform these actions. You can pick up enemies and slap them around, again, just like the comics and movies. In a word, it is perfection. Unfortunately, if you haven't grown up a fan of the series and always wanted to play a game that looks like this, then it gets old really fast. I have never played a more repetitive brawler than this. Smash through some Romans, walk forward, smash through some Romans, walk forward, and then just keep doing this for the next several hours. There are probably only 4 or 5 levels that again are all repeated multiple times throughout those several hours, and the bosses are just the same 4 or 5 meatheads that pop up at random times, including in the final level where several are brought out at once. It's just a shame because the basis for what could be the perfect ASTERIX game is here. But I can't help but feel like this game's basics were perfectly created and then they ran out of time, so they just looped it 4 or 5 times over and called it a day. You once again can only play as Asterix and Obelix, and what's crazier still is that the magic potion power-up, which is just so incredibly obvious to include in a game like this, isn't included. You see, Asterix takes a sip when you charge characters that can be done on the fly, but it doesn't actually do anything. Still, with all that said, as I am such a huge fan of the franchise and the genre, I did enjoy my time, but I can't deny that I constantly thought to myself, my god, this is repetitive multiple times, before finally thinking, oh, was that it? It repeats over and over and over again, and then, after you've beaten a couple of bosses that you've already defeated in earlier stages, it just ends. As stated, I got this game physically in this big and beautiful box from Strictly Limited Games. Again, thank you very much, guys. And on top of it also including the free XXL Rome Mastered games, it also includes a whole heap of extra goodies, including these rather nice and fairly hefty statues. And this led me down a very, very weird rabbit hole. For the price, I think one physical plus 3 remasters and a crap ton of extras is a decent price. But I'm a physical guy at heart, so I decided to look and see if you can get those XXL games physically, which, yes, I could as either a bundle on the Switch, or I could get the XXL on its own. XXL 2 has the same Asterix statue as this one I got, but coloured. XXL 3 has the same Obelix statue as the one I got, but again, that one was also coloured. The Mega Collector box is a combination of both, again with the same statues in it. XXXL also has the collector's box with a different statue in it. There is yet a different Slap Them All box set that has yet another statue in it. And finally, Slap Them All did get a sequel, brilliantly titled Slap Them All 2, which yes, also got a collector's box set with the same statues that I already have again. So in short, if you're like me and you want to get physical copies of all of these games, then you'll get the same statue 4 times plus another 2 statues. Asterix and Obelix Slap Them All 2 is the most recent game released within the world of Asterix and Obelix to date, and as you would expect, it's extremely similar to the last game. Unfortunately, we still only have the 2 main characters to play as. However, from the get-go, we do get far more animation and above average voice acting throughout. Extra enemies have been added this time, and all in all, it's a far greater experience than what we had before. With that said, these improvements are minor, and Slap Them All 2 still has the same issues that Slap Them All 1 has. It's a lot more varied than before, the levels are a lot nicer to look at and explore, and yes, the magic potion is now a power-up, but it still feels like it needs just one more entry before it can become a true side-scrolling legend of the genre. And if you ask me, they still need to add genuine bosses instead of reusing ones from the first game, including the final enemy. I'm still waiting for the perfect Slap Them All game, and even though number 2 is better, it's still far from where it needs to be. It's fair to say that Asterix and Obelix have had an extremely varied history, not only within the world of comics, but games too. Sure, they've had some real stinkers with titles that are more shovelware heavy than any other franchise I've ever seen, but they also have quite a few diamonds in the rough that are some of the best games in their respective genres. It's been a long, long journey to get to this point, and even though the characters still struggle to make a mark in quite a few countries around the world, in France for over 60 years, they've been completely undefeated from the competition and, of course, those pesky, pesky Romans. Hey there guys, thanks for checking out Asterix, the History and the Games. Now I know this video isn't going to do too well. I mean, I hope it does. At the end of the day, I always wanted to make this video, even though I know it's probably not going to do too well. Most of my audience is over in the States, and this is a video about a topic that isn't very popular in the States. I still wanted to make this video because I've always been a big fan of Asterix, and I owed it to myself. And if you're one of these people out there that also grew up with Asterix or want to know more about Asterix, you found this video interesting, please do give it a like and a share. It's more important on a video like this than any other. It really is, because I spent an incredibly long time making this video. So yeah, thank you very much if you did make it this far. It was a long time working on this video. And yeah, if you want to support the show, obviously Patreons, no that way around, Patreons and YouTube members get to see videos like this early. They get to see it without any kind of sponsorships or adverts, although I will say I loved the sponsorship for this video, and hopefully lots of other videos coming up as well, because Instant Gaming, like I said, you can get several games that we mentioned in this video damn cheap, as well as plenty of other games as well. I'm going to be using them loads, and if you want to do as well, use those affiliate links down below. It does support the show. It means that these guys are going to keep coming back and supporting the show, and I can continue making videos like this. So thank you. Now, this is the part of the video where I give a massive shout out to all of my Patreons and YouTube members, all of my Game Room squatters, with an extra big shout out going to Swift Justice Peterson, Chris aka Brackman, Robert Ramsey, British Video Game Nerd, Keiju Samurai 1985, Boots and Pup, The Sneaky Ferret, Vitas Varnes, James, The Action Saxon, Jay's Manchild, Mike Fallon, Nicholas Burtner, Chev Matic, Jabba Al Aiden, Richard Alderjic, Shadow Dragon, Dina, Ye Old Hamburglar, Jeff Mianowski, Brian Perez, Conrad Constantine, Andrew Dalton, Retro to Next Gen aka Lou, Paul Float, Ryan Burford, Dina81, Derakuda, I've lost everyone. There we are. Vike Echo, JM, Sir Nilsson, Akatimo84, Ian Quell, Arista, and Mind of the Unsane. Thank you very much, guys. Very much appreciated. I can't thank you guys enough. Yeah, like I say, you want to see these videos early, see them before they come out, get your name shown, get your name shouted out, shown at the beginning of the video, and then get to see all of the other exclusive content I put out there, including the exclusive Kick Scammer news videos. Then all you got to do is sign up to become a Patreon or YouTube member. Now guys, I'm going to be working on some Kick Scammer videos next before I go back to the complete history, and yeah, until next time guys, this is DJ Snope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.